The pathway to this contemporary variation in psychology began with the Western Church, what became the Roman Catholic Church's policies regarding marriage and the family. This then leads to a more individualistic psychology, changes the nature of Western law. So Western law becomes individual-centered and mental state-centered.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment Podcast, a production of Adam Smith's Padmere House. I'm your host, Adam Dixon. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Joseph Henrich, who is a professor at Harvard University in the area of human evolutionary biology. Joseph Henrich's career has spanned numerous disciplines, from economic anthropology to psychology, to conducting ethnographies in different parts of the world. Most recently, he was the author of Weirdest People in the World: How the West Became Psychologically Peculiar and Particularly Prosperous. Before that, in 2015, he wrote the book The Secret of Our Success: How Culture is Driving Human Evolution, Domesticating Our Species and Making Us Smarter. And these are two books that we'll be discussing today, including Joe's future plans. Thank you, Joseph Henrich, for being here.
Well, it's great to be with you, Adam.
So the first question I'd like to ask you, and I alluded to it in the introduction, is the inherent interdisciplinarity of not simply the kind of research that you do, but your career trajectory. I should have mentioned that your first degree was in aeronautical engineering, and then you became a cultural anthropologist. Then you did economic anthropology, you did game theory. More recent work of yours is looking at patent data and collaborating with economists. So you get around in a way that is quite interesting, and not simply do you get around in terms of engaging and collaborating with different people, but your work is broad in the sense of looking broadly in terms of time and also in terms of space, looking at rich countries, poor countries, underdeveloped parts of the world, or hard to access parts of the world. So it's a quite rich experience. So if I had to say the kind of work you do, it's interdisciplinarity at its best. But as you know, universities these days, researchers, even companies, we live in silos and we don't interact sufficiently. And we were discussing yesterday when we met for the first time, you mentioned that what you want is radical interdisciplinarity. And that for me just sums up, I would say, what we need. So can you discuss a bit, what do you mean by radical interdisciplinarity? And what are the challenges of getting there? What are the challenges of conducting interdisciplinary research? And how can we foster more of it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question and something I've thought about a lot. I think one of the experiences I had in graduate school is I arrived with some pretty big questions. So I wanted to explain how it was that humans went from relatively small-scale societies 10,000 years ago to large nation-states in the modern world. And at the core of this question is the problem of cooperation. And as I begin to dig into this, I found that there was a field of economic anthropology that had stuff to say about this. Economic sociology, political science, game theory, and economics had all chimed in on this. They all used different methods and had different theories. And this seemed very inconsistent to me. And they weren't contending with each other at all. So I think one of the things that naturally gave rise to my interest in moving across disciplines was having basic questions for which you might want to use methods from political science or from economics. You might want to use ideas and data from anthropology, and just bringing them all together by being question-driven. And one of the things I found in mentoring graduate students from different disciplines over the years is that graduate students have a tendency to fall in, even if they arrive initially with big questions, they have a tendency to fall into becoming an economist and learning to talk to economists and sort of playing by the rules of different disciplines. And there's obviously lots of incentives in fields to do that. You have to get your papers published and get promoted, and be respected by your mentor, your advisor. So all those things tend to channel people, and it makes the different disciplines into different cultural traditions. So I kind of felt equipped as a cultural anthropologist, because when I started to getting into psychology and economics, I learned that I just had to learn the language, and that there were rules of the game, and there were standards that were different from the standards that I had been accustomed to. But then I also found there were lots of good ideas in these different disciplines that I could harvest and use to address the question in a way that I found satisfactory. Now, on the plus side, I found that I could dive into these different disciplines and make some progress and publish in their journals and stuff if you took the time to learn the language and get the lay of the land. Changing those fields has turned out to be a lot more challenging, which is why I'm in favor of radical interdisciplinarity, which I mean starting a social science field that is based around questions. So my department at Harvard is actually an example. So we're in the life sciences, and our question is, what makes us human? And then we hire neuroscientists and geneticists and anthropologists to help us answer that question. But you could imagine that there could be a social science department which had questions: why do humans cooperate? And the questions could change over time. How do people make economic decisions? How do you build a good institution? Those could change over time, but we would all be working on them using the tools from psychology and statistics from economics, experiments from different disciplines, field methods from anthropology, survey data. All these kind of things can be brought to bear on the question.
So basically, just to sum it up, that you employed your skills as an ethnographer in interacting with different peoples that have different languages and different rules of the game, if you like, to insert yourself into economics and in other fields to learn how to speak their language and then how to play that game and publish in their fields.
That's right. So I've often thought of writing an ethnography called My Life Among Two Strange Tribes, where the subtitle would be Economists and Psychologists.
And economists are probably one of the most difficult tribes to engage with and interact with.
Yes, you have to learn a lot of their language.
Yes. But I'm curious, though, I like this idea of question-driven research. And one of the... the reason why I wanted to ask you about interdisciplinarity and radical interdisciplinarity is that we forget that the disciplines in academia, they are socially constructed and they're contingent on different time periods. There's actually differences across countries often that we don't appreciate. Differences between, even within Europe, there's different kind of traditions within and different epistemic communities, as we can call it. It's less so, I think, today, that due to more travel and interaction and collaboration across countries. But the reason why I wanted to ask you is that we're here at Adam Smith's Panmure House, which, so listeners know, Adam Smith lived there before disciplines, if you like, existed, right? They had natural philosophy and moral philosophy, natural philosophy being what today we consider the hard sciences, and moral philosophy, what we would today consider to be the social sciences. But if you look at individuals like Adam Smith, or at least his social milieu, his best friends were James Hutton and Joseph Black. James Hutton being notionally the father of geology, and Joseph Black, the discoverer of carbon dioxide. And so the social milieu at the time of the late 18th century, when Adam Smith lived at Panmure House, at the kind of height of the Scottish Enlightenment, they were interdisciplinarians by default. They would get together and socialize and discuss issues of science, mathematics, culture, music, art, the economy, and what does it mean to be human? What is our history? And this is where it starts, these disciplines develop. And to employ another Smithian concept, though Smith wasn't the first, is specialization, though, over time, forced those disciplines to come together because you needed increasing levels of specialization to answer some of these hard to get at questions. You needed to be specialized to employ particular methodologies. And that's been a good thing. But now, in the 21st century, we have to ask ourselves, are we too disciplinary focused? And how do we get to that interdisciplinarity? And I like the idea that you say about asking questions and working from those questions by saying, well, what tools do we need? What kind of knowledge, what kind of methods, what kind of people do we need to bring together? I'm curious if you could say a bit more about how that works in practice, in your experience, and how do you make that? Assuming that perhaps some listeners will be academics that are wanting to break down disciplinary boundaries. They want to work with others. How do you do that at an institutional level, and how do you do that also at an interpersonal level?
Yeah, well, there's a few different ways to do that. I can tell you about my own personal experiences. And so, as a graduate student at UCLA, I started using some behavioral economics experiments and behavioral economics tools, and I ran them in the Peruvian Amazon, and I got some unusual results. So my advisor then, Rob Boyd, and I decided that what we needed to do was we wrote a grant to the MacArthur Foundation, and we got money, and we brought together a team of anthropologists who worked in different parts of the world, along with behavioral economists. And the behavioral economists helped train the anthropologists in doing these behavioral games, and then the anthropologists went off to their various field sites, conducted the experiments, but also gathered, doing what cultural anthropologists do. How did people think about the games? What was your reaction when you read this? And then understanding the local context and milieu. So we could seek the games and the experimental results within the local cultural context in a way that anthropologists like, but we also generated systematic replicable data of the kind the economists wanted. So this created a lot of ongoing collaborations just among that group as different people met. So it's one of these things where the funding organization was very excited to fund this. So sometimes I think that interdisciplinary is hard, but if you have the right project, you can get it funded and create these kinds of overlaps. Later in life, when I had my own lab, my lab routinely has anthropologists, psychologists, and people with economics backgrounds, sometimes as postdocs.
Right.
So that just means my whole lab is an interdisciplinary place.
Right, so you purposefully design the projects and the group that you work with to do that.
One of the things, so you can look at this as a glass half full, glass half empty story, in that when you actually produce a piece of research, you have to publish it somewhere.
Yeah.
So my research might go to an economics journal, psychology journal, anthro journal, general science journal, or biology journal. But that means you have to write it for that audience. You have to think about it in that way. But there's also a sense in which you can shop it. So in my early research, I wanted to convince anthropologists because I was trying to become an anthropologist. They were sort of hostile and uninterested. So I just went down the shopping cart and I sold it to economists.
Right.
So you can just find the people who are buying.
Okay, right. So you employed our market logic.
Yes, market logic among disciplines.
Right. So, but on building teams and working in with an interdisciplinary ethos, I think from the outside, people that don't work in universities must think that it must be great to be an academic because you get to be an intellectual and you like ideas. But often, and this is not to denigrate any of our academic colleagues, I'm always kind of taken aback sometimes when I find academics that aren't intellectually curious. Or it's not saying that they're not intelligent, it's just that they're not interested much beyond their specific field. And so I'm wondering on a personal level, how do you identify somebody that's willing to think outside the box, or think outside of their own discipline, and also then have respect for different ways of doing science? So a classic one, just thinking about anthropologists versus economists, if typically anthropologists are doing, or ethnographers are doing very deep, they live in a place for years sometimes to really get to know this is how life is, and it's very deep and it's very textual and it's very narratives of individuals. There's that kind of ethnography. How do you get, and there's a lot of value in that work. It's time consuming. How do you get someone that says, yeah, but can we run a regression on that? And because if we can't run a regression on that, we can't crunch the numbers. It's not real science. How do you find people that are willing to kind of respect each other? Because likewise, there are anthropologists that will say, some of these, if you're looking at big data, you're actually not getting the story. So it goes both ways sometimes. How do you find individuals that are willing to kind of have a conversation, that are willing to interact in a way that is productive, that they both gain, and there's mutual respect? Because I think it's one thing to have the Joe Henrichs of the world that say, I'm just going to build a team, and funders that are going to say, yes, do interdisciplinary, but how do you then find the people and encourage them over the life of the project and in their personal and a kind of intellectual development to think beyond their own, let's say, terrain?
Yeah, I mean, so in my own kind of missionary enterprises, I often will do talks or run panels and stuff at major conferences. So recently we did a whole day on historical psychology, which is this idea of trying to extract psychological measures from texts. And it turns into big data, but I'm trying to bring cultural evolution to psychologists in that case, and the idea that psychology changes over time, rather than the usual assumption, which is whatever you find amongst your MTurk or American undergraduate sample is generalizable to the population. So there's that kind of outreach, but then there's also the Society for Cultural Evolution, which has it's a relatively new society, but it's a place where people from all different disciplines come together to think about cultural evolution. So that's a place where just simply showing up means you're at least open to this diverse set of approaches, even if you yourself are only an ethnographer or only a laboratory psychologist or something like that. And the third is just going to a lot of different kinds of conferences and networking with people. And sometimes you'll find people that are totally disinterested and think that the way other disciplines do it are entirely wrong. And some people that's kind of interesting. I wonder if you could combine these things.
So you just have to, again, to use a market analogy, it's shop around.
Shop around and network and connect with people. And I think it's worthy to try to persuade people, but, some people are open and some aren't.
And are you optimistic or pessimistic that universities and academia is moving in a direction that is towards radical uncertainty? Radical interdisciplinarity. I mean, do you feel that you are unique, or do you feel like we're making ground in terms of doing the kind of question-driven interdisciplinary work that defines your body of scholarship?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're definitely covering ground, and there's chunks of all the major disciplines that I interact with where there are people doing this kind of work, and growing very slowly. Now, in none of these disciplines is this anywhere near the core of the discipline. Yeah. Most people are still doing the same thing. What I'm not sure about is if any universities or other organizations are going to be convinced that they need to create a department that's radical interdisciplinarity for social and biological sciences.
Right, because I think what you find looking at, particularly here in universities in the UK and Europe, in part because there's not a history of the liberal arts education that we have in North America, but you find that increasingly there are attempts to create undergraduate teaching programs that are very interdisciplinary. In the U.S. case, you kind of get interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity. Not interdisciplinary, you get multidisciplinarity by the nature of the liberal arts education system. Whereas in Europe, people, you go and you read physics, as it were, in the UK, and that's what you do for 3 years. But over time, there's increasing effort to create more multidisciplinary teaching programs, and to, in the process, try to create interdisciplinary kind of teaching offerings. But it's really hard. But you see progress on that on the teaching front, but then often it just falls back into multidisciplinary teaching where you take an economics course and then you take a politics course. But I think there's been more progress made on the teaching front, but at the research level or the department type levels, the school levels, there's still a lot of work to be done on that.
Let me give you a radical proposal. If you were a dean or a college president, you could take the sciences, where I'm including both the social and what people call the natural sciences, and you could have every faculty member nominate 10 people in rank order that they would like to be physically close to or they share common interests with. You could also nominate questions or concepts they think are important, and then you could just do a social network. And you would create clusters of people that would naturally emerge from people's shared interests and people who they think would be in. And then you could call that an area. Yeah. And then you could do that every 5 years. They would change over time, which means your divisions would dynamically adapt to the changing landscape. Each cluster would have to come up with courses. Those courses might teach kids game theory and field methods or something like that, because those people think those things are important.
Right.
But you have to be pretty radical.
It has to be radical, and you have to consider people's concern that, well, if I do this, I'm not going to get tenure because my tenure package is based on how many publications I've of published in this particular field in these particular journals.
Right, but unless along with that system, you'd have to figure out how you were going to do promotion and tenure.
Change the incentive
and so
structure.
Maybe each person would be evaluated by their cluster.
Right. Okay, so moving on to your work, much of your work challenges traditional assumptions about human nature, where you suggest that humans are more culturally shaped and less genetically determined than previously thought. How might this perspective influence fields like economics or law and public policy? So can you say a bit more about where you're coming, what's the kind of core question of your research, and how does it influence debates outside of your core kind of disciplinary or more interdisciplinary contribution?
Yeah, so the key idea here is that humans evolved genetically to be a cultural species, which means what we're really good at is learning from other people. And that includes learning things like heuristics and biases and how to make decisions and ways of perceiving the world, judgment, things like that. Which means that things like economists typically assume that preferences are fixed. But we know that preferences evolve over time. So the classic preference would be a food preference. And people's food preferences are heavily influenced by seeing other people like a food. Mm. So you can show this easily in little kids. So people acquire their preferences, which means that preferences are evolving, which is a revelation for economists, or will be an important change in how they think about the world. So it's also true the way we process information, which was big for psychology, which tends to assume that there's software and hardware. Psychologists see themselves as studying the hardware. But what the neuroscience and cultural evolution suggests is that we have kind of firmware that's evolving over time. A simple example would be when we teach kids to read, it actually changes the wiring in their brains. It thickens the corpus callosum, which is the information highway that connects the two halves of the brain. So certain cultural practices, reading is just one example, changes the brain structure. So it changes the physical substrate of how we think. And that matters for how you do psychology and what you think brains do. It changes how humans process information.
So then going on to that question is like how does this perspective then practically influence, or how could it influence the disciplines that we spoke of? How could it influence economics, or how does it influence, so on the one hand, how does it influence research, but then also how can it influence how decisions around policy?
Right. Well, so built into so every decision about policy has embedded in assumptions about human nature, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a theory of human nature if you dig far enough into it, even if people don't realize it. So if you assume that people have basically the same psychology, then if you, say, import a well-functioning institution from Great Britain, say, and you plop it down in Africa, you might think it would do the same thing in terms of generating economic growth or getting people to obey the rules. But what people have found time and time again as Western institutions have been plopped down is that they don't work the same. They seem to malfunction almost. And this makes good sense if you think about how we think and how we feel and reason as co-evolving with our institutions. So that means there's no one-size-fits-all institution. Right. You need a hand-in-glove fit between your institutions and the local psychology.
And we know that institutional change or institutional development is a very, very long process. We kind of take for granted that, and this just leading back to the Scottish Enlightenment and the likes of Adam Smith, is that the growing kind of liberal environment that they lived in, where individuals started to have more rights. I mean, they were writing in the late 18th century in a very pre-democratic context, but still, people more and more were having certain freedoms, and this, eventually kind of led to, democracy eventually took hold, and mass democracy took hold, but that evolution was, on the one hand, at least for Smith, was wholly unexpected. It wasn't that a bunch of people got in the room and they put up a veil of ignorance and they decided this is the kind of institutions of government we'd like to have, and these are the institutions of the kind of norms and conventions around how markets operate. No, these things evolved over time, often through very contingent and events, and once you add in the kind of the psychology of it, right? So people get used to these things. That change over time has to be appreciated, because, like you said, you try to take an institution and say, well, we're going to make democracy work in X country, And you try that, and you think, well, yeah, but there's all these other kind of barriers that, and it's not for lack of trying, right? I mean, I think we assume that it's because the population is just completely against this idea of choosing their rulers, and it's actually not that simple, right? There's a lot of cultural cues, and if you're saying a lot of these are psychologically driven, that doesn't mean we shouldn't foster democratization when we can, because that's always an excuse if we don't foster it, that it's okay to then just say, be a cultural relativist and say that change shouldn't be offered or at least fostered in other places. Moving on to your book, The Secret of Our Success, which delves into the role of cultural evolution in shaping human success. Could you elaborate on how cultural learning and transmission have contributed to our species as humans on this world and our ability to adapt and thrive?
Yeah, so the key idea there is that because humans are so good at learning from each other, if you imagine passing down information from one generation to the next, in which each generation makes some small changes and small improvements, over many generations you eventually can get tools and technologies, practices, ways of thinking that are more sophisticated and better adapted to the environment than any one individual has time to figure out in their lifetime. So in a sense, our culture is smarter than we are because it has the accumulated wisdom that accumulates over many generations. And this then becomes one of the primary drivers of our species' genetic evolution. So we're really a kind of gene culture package in which our physiology, anatomy, brain sizes all has been co-evolving with our reliance on this large body of adaptive information, which includes a language and tools and all this kind of stuff.
Can you simplify it a bit so listeners can understand? Because I think understanding what do you mean by genetic evolution, and how does that relate then to culture, right? What is it that, can you give us some concrete example that people can
so
latch onto?
A simple and probably well-studied example is fire and cooking. Mm-hmm. So we clearly know that humans don't innately know how to make fire. We have to learn how to make fire and cook. But it's clear from a number of different kinds of approaches that we have a physiology from our teeth to the size of our colons to the stomachs, mm-hmm. that we have evolved to be a species that cooks. Mm-hmm. So cooking essentially pre-digests food before we take it in, so we don't need the big stomachs that apes have and the long intestines that they have. So we pre-digest our food by cooking, denaturing the proteins, and essentially digesting outside of our body to put it in. So you can't understand our genetic evolution of our digestive system and our teeth, our jaw muscles, without recognizing that we're a cooking species.
Okay, but these changes happen over hundreds of thousands of years.
In this case, yeah.
Yeah. How, because I imagine some listeners are wondering, okay, well that's a great story of human evolution. We can see moving from, being cave peoples to modern societies, but the assumption is that when does that evolution stop, or when does it become irrelevant for the kind of time period that we normally live in or think about?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we can expect genetic changes over hundreds of years. We do think there have been genetic changes over the last 10,000 years. Okay. So in the book, some of the best evidence I look at are things like about 1/3 of humans has the ability to process lactose into adulthood. So these are milk sugars. Right. So populations that have a long history with dairying, with keeping mm-hmm. cows, for example, or camels, if those populations didn't rapidly develop cheese and yogurt technology, then they may have had a genetic response that allows them to process and get the nutritional benefits of milk into adulthood. So humans, like all mammals, can drink milk as infants, mm-hmm. but then normally the standard mammalian thing is shut off after weaning and we lose the ability. But in this 1/3 of humanity, this mechanism doesn't operate. And we actually know the specific gene, it's actually very different in different populations, that throws a monkey wrench in this process. And this gives us this nutritional benefit from milk. And we can explain the variation in that gene by knowing the details of the population histories.
And then, okay, so you say over the last 10,000 years, I mean, is it possible that there's ongoing genetic changes that are happening that we aren't realizing or appreciating?
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason that natural selection would ever stop. So just to give you two simple examples, and they're somewhat controversial examples, but it follows from the logic, would be ever since the demographic transition where families got small, it's been the case that wealthier people had fewer kids.
Right.
And especially when you educate girls, it means that more educated women tend to have fewer children. And we know there's a whole bunch of genes that, at least in the 20th century, are associated with getting more education. And there's studies showing that those genes are under negative selection. So selection is naturally favoring the higher fertile people who tend not to go to school. But this is a great case of culture and genes competing with each other, because the effect of genes over a century is about 1 year of schooling, while cultural evolution has raised the average amount of schooling by 12 years.
Right.
So culture is stomping all over genes in a face-off here.
Right, because I guess the point to make is that you're not, as some listeners may perhaps think, that you're not making a biological determinist argument. You're still allowing for kind of biological determinism to a degree, if that's correct.
Yeah.
But the big portion is culture and society, effectively.
Yeah, although I want to resist the temptation to divide biology and culture. So one of the main points of The Secret of Our Success is that cultural changes are biological changes. So I mentioned to you earlier the changes in our brain structure when we learn to read. So that's a non-genetic biological change.
Right.
And if you raise twins, so it's exactly the same genes, in different societies, they end up with different biologies.
Right.
Because there's more to biology than just genetics. So this is something that's missed, and it tends to miss because people think dualistically. They think it's either sort of nature and genes and biology, or it's culture and learning and society. But that's not how it looks from this perspective. Right.
So it's the simple way to put it: if before we thought it was nature versus nurture, and what you're saying is actually that binary is a false binary.
Is no good. And the key move that I mentioned earlier is that natural selection built our capacities for culture, and our brains are the machinery that does all this learning. So our brains change and respond. They've evolved to change and respond to the cultural milieus we find ourselves in. So learning different languages causes you to think differently, hear different sounds. There's a whole bunch of, that's just the case in language. Yeah.
Okay, and then the book that came after the Secret of Our Success, Weird, which is it's a genius title. I love it. With weird meaning Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And that's gained some traction in just understanding human behavior. How does this concept inform your research, or what is that concept, let's say, and what are some of its limitations and or criticisms?
Yeah. Well, so we first coined the WEIRD acronym in a paper that I published with some collaborators, two social psychologists, Steve Heinen and Arnor Zion, in the journal Behavioral and Brain Sciences in 2010. It was called The Weirdest People in the World. And there, this acronym, we used it to raise as a consciousness-raising device for psychologists and behavioral economists and other people who do research. And the problem we were pointing to is that nearly all of the subjects used to flesh out, quote, human psychology and human behavior, preferences, and economics were from societies that are weird, Western, educated, industrial. And in fact, they're mostly American. So this, in psychology anyway, it's dominated by American research. These days, it's mostly Americans on this online platform called MTurk, but the same problem applies. And what we show in that paper is that not only are Westerners the typical subjects used, one population among many with lots of psychological variation, but they're an unusual population along a bunch of dimensions that psychologists and economists think are important, whether you're talking about economic preferences or you're talking about the kinds of things social psychologists study.
Okay, so can you say a bit more about what is the key message then from Weird, or the Weirdest People?
So it's really a message to researchers, meaning the paper, that you need to think about who you're sampling from when you're making your generalizations about human behavior. So still to this day, we've made some progress here, but still to this day, psychologists and others will routinely run experiments with Americans and then generalize to the species.
Right.
And in many cases, I already know it doesn't generalize.
Yeah.
And
they run experiments on undergraduates at universities, right?
Yeah,
it's
traditionally
already a very selective group.
Yeah, exactly. Selective among the selective.
Yeah.
So remember, it's just a consciousness raising device. Sometimes people have tried to read a theory into it, or try to ask me what the W stands for. It's just to get people to pay attention to their subject pools. I'm not trying to say any more.
Right. No, I mean, because again, when you look at Western, that can mean different things to different people, right? So some look at Western as an ethnic ethno geographical indicator. Others might look at Western as the existence of liberal democracy, and that would include then the likes of South Korea, Japan. So it's not just exclusive to Western Europe or Europe and North America and Latin America for that matter. But others then, so it's quite a loaded term, and I'm curious. And the reason why I ask is I had one of the previous podcast episodes we had Paul Tucker, and we discussed about what does it mean. What are Western values, and what's at stake for Western society, particularly in the rise of an aggressive Russia, a more authoritarian China. So the stakes are quite high. What is then, so that's why I'm curious how then in your work, and this is more of a political question or a geopolitical question, but it's sensitive even in the Western context because there's a lot of reflection and criticism. What does it mean, and how do you employ it such that you don't get caught up in, let's say, culture war debates?
Yes, and so I use it as this consciousness raising device, and then when I go into the weirdest people in the world, I'm actually trying to explain the psychological variation we find around the world. So there I move to explaining the psychological variation, which you can see patterns that show that the classic countries we might want to definitely put in the Western category are have a particular psychological profile that's distinct, at least at the country level. But then I'm offering an explanation for this psychological variation that is independent of using the acronym, doesn't rely on any of those definitions or anything like that. And that's these ideas about the diffusion of the Roman Catholic Church.
Right. Can you say a bit more about then the core argument and what kind of data and what's the narrative behind it?
So the puzzle is, why is there this interesting pattern of psychological variation that includes individualism, analytic thinking, trust in strangers, an emphasis on mental states and moral judgment, and a few other things, nonconformity, that we see cluster in some parts of the world. And in the book, I make the argument that the pathway to this contemporary variation in psychology began with the Western Church, what became the Roman Catholic Church's policies regarding marriage and the family. So Europe, like many parts of the world, had clans and kindreds, had cousin marriage, had all these things. Roman Empire had no polygyny, but had all the other stuff. And so as the church spreads through Europe, it breaks down the traditional kinship systems into these monogamous nuclear families. People then have to build new kinds of institutions. So historians have long noted that the High Middle Ages is a period of all these voluntary associations, including guilds, people voluntarily moving to charter towns, the emergence of universities, monasteries begin spreading and get a particular character. So to replace the kinship stuff, they build all these new kinds of institutions which are non-kin based. This then leads to a more individualistic psychology, changes the nature of Western law. So Western law becomes individual-centered and mental state-centered.
And just to point, kin-based mean families,
clans,
extended families.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And then eventually leads to things like representative government.
So it's not then, I guess, because from the outside someone might be listening. It's religion that counts. It's the moral foundation of the Judeo-Christian tradition. But that's not quite the argument, is it?
No, not at all. In one of the book, one of my lines of research is looking at the evolution of religion over time, and Christianity is important in the sense that it has notions of moral universalism and free will, but you can find those in lots of other world religions. And those world religions probably played a role in the scaling up of human societies, at least I've argued with it. But there's nothing particular to Christianity in general that makes them distinct, and including in our experiments. I'm talking about, we have real data. What does seem to make Christianity unique, this one branch of Christianity, this Western Church one, are the particular extreme policies they have regarding the nature of family structure. And that's why, you don't see the effect I'm talking about in Coptic Christianity, for example, or Syrian Christianity.
Okay, so is that history then contingent, right? So it was contingent on a particular decision that was made. I mean, what drove that sense of we're going to break down kinship and effectively codify monogamy and codify the nuclear family structure?
Yeah. Well, so one of the things, that's an important question, but one of the things I like to point out is that religions periodically do all kinds of interesting stuff to kinship. So, for example, at the same time these ideas were developing, over in Persia, Zoroastrianism was celebrating marrying your cousins and actually promoting brother-sister marriage among the elites, which is super rare in human history. Islam constrains men to only have 4 wives, and also makes some inheritance rules which end up shaping the networks of Islamic societies. And you can look at the Second Great Awakening in the United States, when a whole bunch of new religions pop up, including Mormonism. And there's a religion called the Shakers, where people were banned entirely from having sex. So religions get all kinds of ideas about what God wants regarding marriage and the family. So this could just be a kind of mutation. One particular branch of Christianity got obsessed with these particular patterns.
But that was critical to unleashing a particular kind of social evolution.
But it could have happened in Afghanistan.
Right. Oh, okay. Well, that's. But then I'm curious, taking that argument forward, because, thinking about, politics in America, or even in Europe for that matter, right? So the religious right is very much family values and, pushing this kind of moral view of the family, but then they also add to this, yes, but these lead to other positive outcomes. Has your work been mobilized by that politic of...
Not that I'm aware of.
Not that we're aware of. And have you received any pushback on the Where Does People? Any kind of criticisms that are...
Well, sometimes... some critics who haven't read very closely, in my view, try to turn it into a race thing. So they start to say weird is just white people. And so, we have lots of data that that's not the case, that people in the United States end up looking weird psychologically regardless of the origins of their choice.
Right, because that was kind of what I was wondering. Just even using the phrase Western, right? Often it kind of is because some people do use it in to indicate or to a racial grouping of people. But you're saying and that has been, I guess, then through that kind of thing as just naturally thrown at you.
And if people read the book, which doesn't always happen, but if you read the book, I spend a lot of time comparing different parts of Europe with other parts of Europe. So I'm comparing white people to white people, and I show all the same effects. And I also do an analysis in China where I compare only Han Chinese to other Han Chinese, and I show the effects of the theory. And I focus on Italy, and I compare only Italians with only other Italians, and get the same effect.
Yeah, because the risk is that that by mobilizing Western, that assumes that other parts of the world aren't innovative, aren't kind of have potential in a way that it could be easily mobilized by those that have a different politics, if you like, for that.
So one of the things I argue is that it very much undermines these notions of European triumphalism, because it shows that, one, there's a lot of contingency, And two, there's no kind of essential Europeanness. First, this changed over time just relatively recently in my standards, last 1,000 years. And two, it's not essential because I can tell you differences between Italian provinces based on the history of whether the church was there or not.
Right.
And so it's not about being white, it's not about being European, any of that stuff. It's about the details of the history of your little region.
Right. No, and that's important because, there's a European Parliament elections coming up, and it's the radical right will likely do well, and, it's identity is a big factor in that politics, and we see that in Central and Eastern Europe, even in Western Europe. You see radical right parties that always have and they're more explicit about that kind of ethno-nationalist view, and that ethno-nationalist view, claims some superiority to the particular population based on Judeo-Christian values and the like, but your work is actually saying, well, no, that's
totally undermines it.
Right. Okay. So moving on, and this is just the last question to wrap up, and perhaps it's too big of a question, but what are the political implications of your work in terms of international relations, that is, between states and international development policy, right? So if you like, it's, the world is still very different and diverse, and economic development is very different across the world. We do have different societies. We do have different cultures. You mentioned earlier, Western development of plopping an institution down in some part of sub-Saharan Africa and expecting it to work, but that's not. If we can probably kind of circle back to that, what are the implications, or if you like, what is it about your work that we can take to influence or inform international development policy or international relations, such that we can still share good institutional practices? We can still share, because that's, I think, is important. It's not about, they won't work, but how can we kind of make things that we think, and again, it's not about imposing on particular populations, but again, assuming that we want to share, if there's virtue in that, or if, again, a lot of these populations, they want to, there's agency within developing countries and societies to have markets, or to have kind of more well-being and welfare, and to grow their economies. How then can we, and again, I shouldn't say we, but the West, or how can your ideas then inform those policies?
Yeah, well, the first lesson I would take, and this is really coming from The Secret of Our Success, is that a cultural evolutionary view is a Darwinian view, and it also recognizes that humans are bad at predicting what a well-functioning institution is. And we're particularly bad at guessing well-functioning institutions for people that are relatively culturally different from us. But even if you're not very culturally different, you're not so good at it. So you want to create a laboratory where lots of different institutional experiments can occur. So something like having different cities try different policies to accomplish something, and let watch the variation and see if you can learn from the internal performance of these little experiments. So that's a basic kind of cultural evolutionary point of view, and then you need things to evolve locally, because you need stuff that's going to fit with the psychology. And it doesn't mean the psychology won't change. So you may be wanting to nudge the psychology in one direction or another. I think trust is very important.
Right.
So you might be trying to develop systems that increase trust. In my story, the family plays a big important role. But it would be really bad policy to suddenly demolish the family by suddenly outlawing cousin marriage and polygyny and stuff that's legal in places, because that is the safety net for a lot of people. It's their kin group.
Because they have no welfare state, right?
Exactly. So you need to thread that needle.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think we could probably talk about that question for a lot longer, and your work is very rich, and there's much in the last two books. And just actually, no, I'm going to ask you one last question. What's next for Joseph Henrich? What's the next book?
Yeah, the big project right now that I'm working on is called Collective Brains, and it's trying to take these cultural evolutionary ideas and apply them to innovation, and particularly in the modern world. So I've done that to the Industrial Revolution and the weirdest people in the world, and then to human evolution writ large in The Secret of Our Success. But now I want to think about the last 200 years or something, and think about how minds come together to produce great art, fancy technologies, new recipes, diverse institutions.
That sounds like a fantastic book, and I hope when it comes out that you'll join me again on the New Enlightenment podcast to discuss it, because like your other books, I imagine it'll be just as fascinating and interdisciplinary as we would expect. Joseph Henrich, thanks for being on the New Enlightenment, and I hope to speak with you again soon.
All right, great to be with you, Adam.
You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.